El Paso's Hueco Tanks is made possible in part by a grant from El Paso Electric, your electric company, and by a grant from Commissioner's Court of El Paso County. The El Paso County Historical Society, promoting El Paso County history since 1954. Production for El Paso's Hueco Tanks is also supported, in part, by the Texas Historical Commission's Texas Heritage Trails Program, by a grant from the Hunt Family Foundation, and by Capstone Productions, Inc., telling El Paso's story to the world. This is one of the most unusual places on Earth. These rocks rise more than 400 feet out of a flat desert floor and extend thousands of feet down into bedrock. This is a place where the desert keeps its water, where early people hid secrets for all to find. Where conquistadors and cowboys found an oasis. And wagon trains crossed paths with Indian tribes. For modern Native Americans, it is a sacred place, a gift from nature. For hikers and climbers from all over the world who come here to test their skills, it is an outdoor paradise. For scientists, it's home to species found nowhere else on Earth. And for the state of Texas, this small mountain range, with its rich natural and cultural history, is a treasure to preserve. This world-class wonder in far west Texas is El Paso's Hueco Tanks. It is barely 1 mile wide and about 2 miles long. Hueco Tanks is small compared to the vast mountain ranges of the Southwest, and it is different geologically. Hueco Tanks is divided into 4 areas. On North Mountain, visitors can hike on their own. On West Mountain, East Mountain, and East Spur, a guide takes the lead. The cultural heritage in these small mountains is priceless, and these measures are taken to preserve it.
The rock itself is igneous, formed from molten magma. The radiometric age dates on it put it somewhere in 35, 36, 37 million years, so, geologically very, very young.
Over centuries of erosion, these old volcanic rocks cracked and weathered into catch basins, or hollow areas, that hold the rare and precious rainfall. And for centuries, that's what's attracted animals, plants, and humans to Hueco Tanks, a name forged in history. Hueco is a Spanish word that means a hollow place, and a tank is a vessel that holds water.
The Huecos store water for weeks after rains that provides water for the plants and the animals, some of which are those that you would not find anywhere else. When the rest of the desert is dry, Hueco Tanks has water. And that water lets us have juniper trees, oak trees, willow trees, grasses. That's what lets us have the wildlife. The wildlife is here at Hueco Tanks because of the water. And the concentration of plants and animals it's something that you can't find anywhere else.
The rocks provide shade, essential in the high desert, where summer temperatures can top 100 degrees. But that's not all. As they break down, the rocks add minerals and nutrients to the soil, creating microhabitats where a greater diversity of plant life can grow and thrive than in the surrounding desert.
And if you're flying above Hueco Tanks, looking down on the rock masses, you'll see green all around the bases of the rocks, and that becomes less and less so as you're moving away from the rocks. So this actually is, in a very real sense, an oasis in the desert that has the things that the plants and animals, and eventually people as well, would need for life.
The limestone that once covered Hueco Tanks has eroded away. Erosion continues today, as huge chunks of rock are broken into smaller boulders. And on some areas of the rock, you'll see a dark chocolatey brown coating, what's called patina.
It's a substance that's made up of everything in rainwater besides the actual rain. All the clays and minerals and metals that you find in rain once the pure water evaporates. And that forms an armor over the rock that helps protect it from further erosion. Without that patina, this rock we're looking at would probably already be eroded flat.
In the process of the erosion, there have been caverns and cavities and so forth formed in the rocks where water ponds, every time it rains, drains down and it stands in these so-called tanks.
There are places here at Hueco Tanks, in the Huecos and in deep cracks and crevices, that never go dry. We can have a record-breaking period without rain, and you can still go to those places if you know where to look, as the Native Americans and early settlers did, and find permanent water. There's at least one place here at Hueco Tanks that has never been known in at least the last 25 to 30 years to ever go dry.
And of course, there's a Butterfield stage stop there that took advantage of the available water. It's a damn long way between Van Horn and El Paso, and there's not much water in between unless you're right along the river, which is hard going for a stagecoach.
For 2 years in the late 1850s, Hueco Tanks was a stop on the main route of the Butterfield Overland Stage. Coaches like this replica hauled mail and passengers on a treacherous 3-week journey from St. Louis to San Francisco. These ruins were once thought to be part of the old stage stop, but now experts think the buildings were a few hundred feet to the south. In 2008, Texas State Park celebrated the 150th anniversary of the Butterfield stage with rides and reenactors.
Now, if you folks are interested in taking the stage, it costs $200 to go from St. Louis to San Francisco. But being that we're at the halfway point, you can probably get on and go to San Francisco for $100. Are you interested in catching the next stage that comes through? See if you want to go all the way to San Francisco?
Just before the start of the Civil War, the Butterfield stage ceased operations, and the Hueco stop was abandoned. A man who came through Hueco Tanks by wagon train in the 1850s kept a detailed diary of his journey. In 2005, a modern-day wagon train reenacted the travels of William Huff as he headed for the gold fields of California. One night while camping at Hueco Tanks, his mules were stolen.
This is where Huff lost his mules, and we're going to stand right in the spot. Also going to see the Indian drawings that he describes. We're going to see that 55,000-gallon cistern. We're going to walk his footsteps.
Middle school kids from California and El Paso reenacted part of Huff's journey, but in reverse, traveling from California to Texas.
I thought it was really fun because in books you can't read about all this stuff. We actually got to experience it. It was really fun and it was a good experience.
The kids took turns riding and walking as they traveled for several days in the desert and made a stop at Hueco Tanks. They ended up in central Texas, where the diary was presented to the great-great-grandson of the author, William Huff, at his grave. From the 1840s to the 1880s, many a traveler aboard a stagecoach or wagon train stopped for water at Hueco Tanks. Some were returning to homes back east. Others were headed west to the gold fields of California. Faced with wild country and hostile Indians, they knew they would find shelter and water at Hueco Tanks. But that's not all they found. Travelers in the 1800s also found spectacular and rare rock art called pictographs, painted pictures hidden in caves and crevices.
Here in the distance, you can just catch the edges of the Franklin Mountain Range, which is in central El Paso. And standing here, we're looking down into Mescalero Canyon at Hueco Tanks State Historic Site. Just above me, up here above the ledge, are some exquisite examples of Jornada Mogollon rock paintings.
Experts have cataloged more than 3,000 pictographs at Hueco Tanks. In the 1700s and 1800s, Native Americans recorded their history on the rocks, telling stories of battles and daily life. 1,500 years before that, groups of hunters and gatherers lived here. They created most of the rock art, including 200 paintings that look like masks, or perhaps faces, in the largest collection of its kind in North America. The very earliest rock art is from the Archaic period, about 5,000 years ago.
I think Hueco Tanks is one of the most important rock art sites in the Southwest, in terms of the content, in terms of the age, all of those things, right? It's more rare than a lot of rock art because they're pictographs rather than petroglyphs. So ultimately they will disappear probably more rapidly than some of the petroglyphs. Hueco Tanks is El Paso's largest and oldest art gallery. Okay? And this stuff is local. We don't have any evidence even suggesting that people came up from Mexico and painted this. No, this is local. This stuff is ours.
The earliest inhabitants of Hueco Tanks were probably the Folsom people, who lived about 10,000 years ago. Folsom spear points have been found there. It's thought they used the area's natural features to catch game.
Seems likely that what was happening is that Folsom people were driving bison into that interior part and trapping them for hunting, what we would call a surround or a trap. That's a pretty common approach for Folsom people throughout the Southwest. We see that in a number of places. And the interior part of Hueco Tanks makes an ideal location for that.
Over the next several thousand years, some of the ancient people began making pottery, and by about 200 AD, a culture called Jornada Mogollon was flourishing at Hueco Tanks. They were followed by the Pueblo people, and then the Mescalero Apaches, just before the arrival of the Spanish, about 400 years ago.
And as early as 1778, there were records by the Spanish that passing through this area they saw large encampments of Mescalero Apache people. And in the caves and shelters, especially in Mescalero Canyon behind me, are many pictographs that are from the Apache people that show dancing, ceremonies, designs that are related to their culture. Also, the Kiowas, who now reside in the Oklahoma area, were involved with the history of Hueco Tanks. There was a siege which occurred here in 1839 when a Kiowa group of 10 to 20 people were pursued and surrounded here at Hueco Tanks by a group of Mexican soldiers. And after a 10-day siege, there was an eventual escape by this group of Kiowa people. And that event and their experiences here, they see as being very tied to a pictograph panel that is also here in the canyon behind me.
So the pictographs tell us that for centuries, Native Americans have come here for sanctuary and for religious and spiritual reasons, not just for the life-giving water. That includes the Tigua people of the Isleta del Sur Pueblo in El Paso.
Please visit Hueco Tanks. It's a very sacred place to all of us, all Native peoples. But also remember that it's a shrine to us. It's hallowed ground. Many of our people's bones are buried there. You walk upon them sometimes, and there's this inanimate spirituality that is intact, that is always there.
When we go out there for a purpose to pray, a purpose to respect, a purpose to take care of the place. Of course, it's very sacred because of the water that there is there.
A former park ranger who lived and worked at Hueco Tanks recognized the unique relationship that Native Americans have with this land.
They're the only group of people that when they go there can think about and even mention, like in some of these Tiwa families. My great-great-grandfather came here with a group of warriors and suffered here and sacrificed here and prayed here and shed blood here. My great-great-great-great-grandfathers would come here and camp and enjoy and pray, give birth, live, maybe die and even be buried here. Now those are very distinct and different facts and ties to that site the general public simply does not have.
When people are out there hiking, when they're out there climbing, when they're out there bouldering, you know, leaving their tracks behind, you know, it would be the same way as me going into a church, you know, and try to do all kinds of stuff on their altars, which is not right.
As early as the 1920s, a citizens group called the El Paso Archaeological Society had called for preservation of Hueco Tanks. In the meantime, local residents saw Hueco Tanks as a place to have fun, a family picnic, to walk the dog, or climb on the rocks.
And meanwhile, below the surface of all of that was thousands of years of cultural history, important archaeology that isn't found anywhere else in the world. All of these things were hiding below the surface and people weren't aware of them. And what we want now, and the only way to save this place, is to build awareness in every single person who comes that all of these things are here, and to open their eyes and open their minds to those things so that they can enjoy them and at the same time protect them.
This used to be the ranch for my grandparents, Silverio and Pilares Contreras. This was actually a family home, and they built this home first.
In 1898, Silverio Escontrias acquired Hueco Tanks as a ranch, and his family operated the site until the 1950s. They charged visitors a small fee to enjoy the scenic area. Over the next decade, developers tried to turn Hueco Tanks into a tourism spot, like an old west town or a dude ranch. A resort hotel was proposed, and streets were laid out for new homes. That road grading ruined untold archaeological riches. The resort hotel would have destroyed a field of ovens where, thousands of years ago, agave cactus was baked for food. Another developer thought a lake would be a great attraction, so he built a dam. Even more archaeology was destroyed as bulldozers scraped centuries of native culture and history from the center and piled it into a dam. But because of the area's porous soil, the lake could not hold water. As project after project failed, the public outcry in El Paso grew, and people mobilized to save Hueco Tanks. In September 1965, the El Paso County Historical Society and El Paso Congressman Richard White led a campaign to get Hueco Tanks away from development and into conservation.
In the mid-1960s, El Paso County acquired Hueco Tanks and began operating it as a county park. On June 12, 1969, the county gave Hueco Tanks by special deed to the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department.
About the same time, the Tigua Indians of the Isleta del Sur Pueblo were recognized as a tribe by the state and federal governments. They claimed Hueco Tanks as part of their heritage, and there was a proposal to give Hueco Tanks to the Tiguas, but that never happened. In the early 1970s, the El Paso Archaeological Society conducted the first survey of the site. What they found was astonishing: evidence of an ancient village that dated back to pre-Pueblo people. That meant people were living at Hueco Tanks before the year 1150 AD. Texas Parks and Wildlife conducted a thorough archaeological survey of Hueco Tanks beginning in 2004. The chief archaeologist is Margaret Howard.
What we have in this, what's called sometimes Hueco Tanks Village over in this direction, are isolated adobe rooms. They did make adobe blocks, they piled them together, they plastered their floor with adobe, they had a little circular hearth. So these are things that still survive in the ground archaeologically.
That's one reason why all visitors to Hueco Tanks are required to watch an orientation video. It explains that there are archaeological treasures everywhere, and it's never a good idea to dig a hole or let your dog dig one.
This is a spiritual place. It's a very important place for people. And during this village period, people lived here for a long time. People were born, people died. Some of those people were buried in the village area. More people are placed up in these rocks. Hueco Tanks is a very special place for people. People have been laid to rest here. We leave those people where they were laid to rest. They belong here. This is where they were put. They sometimes are in relation to water sites. They sometimes have some pottery with them. These are special graves of very special people. So we start to see more and more people being laid to rest here at Hueco Tanks. It starts to tell us that this is a landmark, a territory for people.
This is what sacred places do. They restore to the person something that they may have lost, like spirit. I suggest that people who have strayed from the road go to Hueco Tanks and sacrifice your avarice, you know, and come back to the sacred place again.
We need to open up our eyes to see all the beauty also and the spirituality of this place. To say that, hey, we have a place of refuge also, a place to come to and for the weekend or just for the day, and to let all our problems out here and leave it here, because this was a place of healing, a place of spirituality.
This sacred place, invested with the ancient beliefs of mankind, must not perish from the earth. O Creator, grant me the courage to wield the warrior's shield against those who would desecrate your holy place. O Creator, grant me the serenity that I may walk in harmony with your creation and with my brothers and sisters. O Creator, grant me the compassion that I may look into the heart of my fellow man and find there reconciliation. O Creator, grant me a despairing heart that I may ask permission with a humble spirit before I enter your tabernacle.
For centuries, passers-by and visitors to Hueco Tanks knew about the pictographs. In the 1850s, John Russell Bartlett surveyed the area and made drawings of the rock art. In the 1930s, a much more extensive survey was made, and those paintings are still used for research today.
These are images that were painted originally between 1934 and 1942, when Forrest Kirkland, a Dallas commercial artist, and his wife Lulu began recording rock art throughout Texas. And in these images, we can really see three different periods. We can see images, some over here, for instance, that probably date to the Archaic period, perhaps 2,000 years ago, and then other images that are probably from what we call the Jornada Mogollon, perhaps 1,000 years ago, and then these, with horses shown, are historic, right? So those would be just a few hundred years ago. And all of these were recorded in watercolor, a fairly difficult medium, by Forrest Kirkland.
On this day, a guide is hiking to a place called Cave Kiva to see some of the strange and intriguing painted masks on North Mountain.
As we've hiked up here, all you've seen so far is just a boulder that looks like any other boulder. But underneath this boulder is a hollow, and there are 8 masks painted inside. Before people go in to look at the pictographs, usually we just let everybody know how important this place is as a sacred site and as a wonderful example of Jornada Mogollon culture pictographs at about 1150 AD. These are 2 of the most often photographed and also best preserved examples of painted masks at Hueco Tanks. Some of the interesting features about them include the horns on the mask here to the right. Here to the left, we have a mask with what looks like a rainbow here in the headdress. And that's indicative of water, as are perhaps these lines coming down from the eyes. Here in Cave Kiva, we find a lot of different types of very interesting sacred masks. The masks here are part of a collection of more than 200 masks, and it's the largest collection of painted masks in all of North America.
Just to the right, you can see what looks like a shadow. The word cobras was painted there more than once, and words have been painted over 2 masks. Texas Parks and Wildlife has spent over $50,000 for professional conservators to remove graffiti from pictograph sites.
The masks here at Cave Kiva were very important to the Jornada Mogollon culture as part of the symbolism of this entire place. Hueco Tanks itself was basically an oasis. It was a place where the geology allowed rainwater to stay around much longer than it does in the general desert. So that's really what was sacred about Hueco Tanks, is that, as many people have said before me, this place could be the difference, and no doubt was the difference, between life and death for early people. And what is that but sacred?
You know, one of the other things about it, too, it's one of the great rock climbing areas here in North America. I mean, if you're into rock climbing, you know about Hueco Tanks. Now, you may not have climbed it, but you know about it. And it's a world-renowned site from that regard.
My husband and I specifically moved to El Paso because of Hueco Tanks. We'd find ourselves making about 5 trips every winter, and we're like, why are we driving all this way? Let's just move there. And so we moved here. Bouldering is what Hueco Tanks is known for, and that's kind of more gymnastics of climbing. It's very short problems, but they're very hard.
What we're doing here is bouldering, and it's fun because it's hanging out with friends and just being next to the rock out in the wild. Bouldering is climbing without ropes. Hueco Tanks is the best bouldering place in the world. This place, there's so much bouldering in a concentrated area. I have friends from all over the world that come here, and they come here to boulder. We just scramble through the rocks. Every boulder problem is different. You can go to a boulder problem that has open-handed problems, you know, and I mean, there's such a variety here compared to anywhere else. The nearest place comparable to Hueco Tanks is South Africa. You know, it's spectacular here. The weather's awesome. We have crash pads, you know, and it's a big cushion that you fall on if you can hit it, you know, and if you have nice friends, they'll direct you towards it. It's just a spectacular place to come. Hueco Tanks is where it's at as far as bouldering goes.
This is the area known as Mushroom Boulder. It has been closed for a few years due to the soils underneath the overhang that have become loosened and eroded. The archaeology has become exposed, and in order to protect it, this climb has been permanently closed. In here is where people would live at one point. Yeah, there's actually chalk all over this area right here.
Back in 2006, when we had all of those massive rains, the park, I think, really took some big hits. And as a result, in 2007, Mushroom Boulder, which is probably one of the climbers' most loved boulders, was shut down to climbing. They had realized that the erosion around the boulder, in part from the rains and maybe the traffic too, because climbers love this boulder so much, it was shut down. And the shutting down of Mushroom Boulder really, I mean, it wasn't just people in El Paso who felt that. Climbers from all around the country and the world are like, oh my goodness, that's probably one of the most sacred for boulders. You know, it's a very important boulder. It's really sad that the climbing community lost that. Bouldering is different from technical rock climbing, which technical rock climbing is, you know, very involved. You have ropes, you have gear, you have harnesses.
Yeah. Come on, man. Come on. Yeah.
That's going to be Sea of Holes, Hueco Syndrome, Window Pane.
Winter rock climbing at Hueco Tanks is world class. People come from all over to test their skills on bouldering and rock climbing. El Paso weather is mostly clear and sunny and usually snow-free for the many climbers who want to rock climb in the winter months. And the rocks at Hueco Tanks do heat up in the summer to a point where you cannot touch them with your hands. So winters at Hueco Tanks are popular. There are festivals and contests, and that all happens mostly on the west side of North Mountain at Hueco Tanks.
Hueco Tanks has become an extremely popular rock climbing and bouldering area. In 1991, there were 152,000 visitors to Hueco Tanks. So where you have many visitors walking around, and at the time, not a fully developed trail system, it was creating some real challenges to preservation of archaeology there.
For more than 10 years, Claire Dean has been working at Hueco Tanks as a conservator, helping the park manage the graffiti problem and restoring damaged areas.
It would be a great help to conservators like myself who work in places like Hueco Tanks if the public who come to visit the park actually consider themselves conservators too, so that when they're visiting a site, they really think about how old the place is, how important it is culturally, not just to Native Americans or the people who may have created the site that they're visiting, but to them themselves and their kids. And to just kind of keep their hands in their pockets and look with their eyes and not with their hands. That would be huge help to us.
Much of the rock art in the Southwest is what's called petroglyphs, pictures created by chipping at the stone. But at Hueco Tanks, they're mostly painted pictures, pictographs, made by ancient artisans using natural pigments. That makes these paintings all the more rare and important, and the more likely to fade away.
So ultimately they will disappear probably more rapidly than some of the petroglyphs. Over on the left is what it looks like today. It's a little hard to see, okay? But here is this guy right here, is right over here, okay? And then just to his right is the other guy.
Talk about in general the rock art at Hueco Tanks, if you would.
Okay.
And how does it rate in the world class of rock art?
Oh, I would give it an extremely high rating. And it's very different from other rock art sites. A lot of people are more familiar with New Mexico or Utah or Arizona. And you go to those places and the rock art's, you know, it's very visible. It's on the rocks, it's on the cliffs, it's on the bluffs. But at Hueco Tanks, they're kind of squirreled away. And they are not typical. They are more like painted faces, which have in the past been characterized as masks. This is due to research that was done in the 70s and the 80s. I think it's primarily the faces that make it so unique. We're at Site 10C at Hueco Tanks. This is popularly known as the Starry Eyed Man. It's one of the most significant images at Hueco Tanks, and as it turns out, very pivotal to my research here. Not all of the rock art is vivid, but some of the significant ones are painted in yellow, and they're very faded and hard to see. Now, if you look over here, back here to this black image of a goat or a deer, and there's a figure next to it, but this is very characteristic of Jornada Magallon imagery. Typically, you see this black pigment, the expressive eyes, and animated stance. See how the legs, and kind of a stylized human figure. So This would be very characteristic of what we think of as the Jornada Magion, whereas this is pretty distinct from that. And especially with this blue-green pigment, that to me, that really sets it apart from the images here. So there's like 3,000 recorded elements at Hueco Tanks. Of that, probably a few hundred are faces.
I don't conceive of this as a mask. I think it's a face. And I think it represents a mythological individual. It's meant to represent someone, not simply a mask. Yellow is very rare at Hueco Tanks. The green is incredibly rare. And it was those things that Deborah was looking at when she began thinking maybe some of these images were painted by the same person. It was that rarity of pigment, that and then some of the what looked like signature marks, etc.
I observed when I first came there that there were these interesting interlocking crescent marks. Picture two crescent moons facing each other. These interesting marks are used to describe both the feathers on a bird, clearly a drawing painting of a bird, on hair on a face, and also markings of a feline. So all of these coming together, and you see these interesting marks on these three different applications. Boy, the artist in me says that sure looks like the same hand painted it and that it was a style. So I think this bright orange pigment is kind of distinct from the other red pigments. And I was able to tie the master painter's hand to several of these most significant images.
And you know, she's done research that no archaeologist has done in terms of the pigments, right? How were they applied? I mean, she's done some things that are really interesting and revealing in terms of the art. Okay, not the archaeology as much as the art itself. So you can see the work she has done with respect to what was being used for pigments, how was the pigment being applied, right? And it wasn't all being done the same way, right? And they weren't using stencils. There's no evidence for that, right? But you can see what I mean. They have a stencil-like quality about them, right? But that is really a stylistic thing.
Now, in this panel, in this little niche over here, you can see some red, kind of, could be abstract marks. They could be what I call practice marks, where the painter prepared his pigment and then used his brush and actually practiced the consistency on the surface of the rock, bearing in mind that this rock is very porous and very rough, and you would want precisely the right consistency in order to make controlled marks such as we see in the Starry Eyed Man. Now over here, this is even more exciting to me because these kind of yellowish shaped marks, these are what I characterize as crayon marks, and I'm using that term to refer to media that's been mixed with wax. It leaves a very characteristic mark kind of covering the highlights of the rock, the elevated areas. The yellow painter is another painter I have identified, and I find that there are often yellow marks in association with the master painter sites, and sometimes I find red marks in association with the yellow painter sites. So this is very exciting to me, even though it's probably the least unimpressive mark in this particular site.
Oh, there it is, Bob.
Scientists Robert Mark and Evelyn Billow have been mapping the rock art at Hueco Tanks using Global Positioning Systems equipment and a 35mm camera.
When we started bringing out these images on the computer, we were flabbergasted.
Brings out details that are almost invisible to the naked eye.
By digitally enhancing the colors in the art and minimizing those in the rock, enough contrast is recreated to reveal the hidden art.
We're discovering rock art that we didn't even see in the field showing up in photographs. So you can't count on people avoiding the rock art. Until we know where the rock art is, we have to be very careful not to disturb sites.
The El Paso Museum of Archaeology holds a summer camp to prepare for a field trip to the historical site in East El Paso County.
So let's take a look at some of the artwork that you see here. How many different colors do we see? White?
Yellow.
Yellow. What else do you see?
Red.
The camp students learned about one of El Paso's most historic locations, and also about some of the Native Americans who call Hueco Tanks a sacred part of their heritage. the group went to Hueco Tanks on a museum camp field trip.
The site here is called Newspaper Cave, Site 17 by the old numbering system, and shows an interesting span of habitation going back 5,000 to 6,000 years. These were grinding holes for crushing hard seed like mesquite, grinding it up, because they started out it was just a blank piece of rock.
And if you want to camp overnight at Hueco Tanks State Park and Historic Site, there are 20 campsites with access to bathrooms, showers, and water and electric hookups for vehicles. Contact the park for details.
As a scientist, you know, I do research, and part of my research involves looking at aquatic resources throughout the whole Chihuahuan Desert. And of course, those aquatic resources occur out at Hueco Tanks. We have at least 4 species of shrimp out there. We have the tadpole shrimp, the clam shrimp, the fairy shrimp, and seed shrimp. So the shrimp are crustaceans, you know, and that's only one component of these ecosystems. And they are important because a lot of birds and even foxes will eat the shrimp when they're larger, and but there are all kinds of other animals out there too, little microscopic animals and other types of life that have really fascinating life cycles because the Huecos only have water for a short amount of time. These animals have very, very interesting life history strategies to cope with this short duration of their habitat, and so they'll be reproductively mature within a day and start reproducing and laying eggs for the next generation. And we've discovered a new life cycle out there for a group of animals called rotifers, and we've also discovered at least 3 new species out there that hadn't been previously known to science.
And all in the planet?
Right, exactly. So it's all a big interconnected web of life that are very adapted to very short duration of habitat.
Hueco Tanks had a brush with a different type of history because of its hard rock surfaces on the west side of North Mountain, the same area that rock climbers love. In 1935, world-famous sculptor Gutzon Borglum visited Hueco Tanks to see if that rock would make a good carving platform to create some large figures in the stone. His plan for the Hueco Tanks carving was 400 years of pioneering in the Southwest, beginning with the visit of Cabeza de Vaca. Borglum had begun the large figures in Georgia on Stone Mountain outside of Atlanta, and he was in the West looking for a commission to carve a mountain somewhere. While in El Paso, Borglum got word that the people in South Dakota had a hard rock mountain, and unlike El Paso, they had money. Since he could not get funding in El Paso, Gutzon Borglum headed north to carve the famous 4 U.S. presidents in stone on Mount Rushmore.
The bird population, I think, is probably one of the best monitored at the site in terms of species being kept track of, because we have Bob Johnson from the El Paso Trans-Pecos Audubon Society who comes out every month, and he also has some people that he's training to kind of fill his shoes later on, and he does a birding tour and checks off on a checklist everything he sees. Then they do the Christmas bird count, and so we keep files of everything that's been seen, and on occasion we get, you know, strange birds.
Many people don't realize that we have such a diversity of wildlife, particularly birds, in the El Paso area. The birds are attracted here because of the amount of vegetative growth adds to the amount of seeds and so forth available for the seed eaters. And of course, the vegetative growth attracts more insects, and so your insect-eating birds are attracted here. And the variety of the vegetative growth is much more than just out in the open desert. I think I enjoy coming out here just to see the birds themselves, but then when I see a rare one, just to see these rarities that stop by for a bite to eat and a drink of water.
Each year in the fall, Texas Parks and Wildlife hosts the Hueco Tanks Interpretive Fair, with a weekend of exhibits.
That's what's neat. Texas has desert bighorns. We don't have Rocky Mountain. We have desert bighorn sheep.
This one is from Site 17, which is around the corner here.
Yeah.
It's thought to be a jaguar. That's some anthropologist's interpretation of it.
Native dancing. and talks about many aspects of Hueco Tanks and its cultural heritage.
The 9th Cavalry came into Texas through Indianola, completed their basic trainings in San Antonio, and then on out to the forts. The Buffalo Soldiers, how did they survive?
Would mix with the sound of honeybees.
There is storytelling around a campfire, and special guided hikes throughout the park.
And so Hueco Tanks has been like an oasis out in the desert. The rock art site that we want to go to is back over here behind where the trees are on the right-hand corner. What makes Hueco Tanks special is the fact that it doesn't have any springs, but it becomes a source of retained water. The rainwater comes down and gets trapped in the rocks and the soil, and then trickles out slowly throughout the dry times. I tell people to have 2 or 3 parts attached to the stone as they climb. You know, if you have to sit down, you use all the parts the good Lord gave you. You know, you just scoot along, whatever is safe. And in general, it's good to lean to the side, lean close to the rocks, to lower your center of gravity, and don't fall into the cactus. The way out is down this way.
Hueco Tanks has something for everyone. The challenge is to meet the needs of so many interested parties without changing the park or harming its stored heritage and culture.
Hueco always has that ability to really inspire people's interest and inspire new theories and hypotheses that are what keep our knowledge alive at that place. And so there's a lot left to learn.
Hueco Tanks is a world-class jewel in El Paso's desert. Whether you come to climb the boulders, study the plants and animals, or honor the spirits that blow with the wind, Hueco Tanks is alive with experiences that can't be found anywhere else on Earth. Preserving the many treasures of Hueco Tanks is, and always will be, everyone's responsibility. El Paso's Hueco Tanks is made possible in part by a grant from El Paso Electric, your electric company, and by a grant from Commissioner's Court of El Paso County. The El Paso County Historical Society, promoting El Paso County history since 1954. Production for El Paso's Hueco Tanks is also supported in part by the Texas Historical Commission's Texas Heritage Trails Program, by a grant from the Hunt Family Foundation, and by Capstone Productions, Inc., telling El Paso's story to the world.